James Mattis stepping down as U.S. Secretary of Defense. He says Mr. Trump should have a secretary whose views are better aligned with his.
Those differing views, according to officials, include Syria. The president is withdrawing all U.S. forces, and the chorus of bipartisan criticism is getting louder, especially over the president's claims that his pullout is angering Russia, Syria, and Iran.
The idea that Russia, Assad, and Iran are not really happy about us leaving, I disagree with that. They're ecstatic. The only reason they're not dancing in the aisles in Tehran and ISIS camps is they just don't believe in dancing.
Just over 24 hours until funding for the government runs out, Mr. Trump says he will not sign any temporary funding bill that does not include funding for the Mexican border wall.
Has to. Not for political purposes, but for our country, for the safety.
And in San Francisco, the Yemeni national mother is now spending time with her dying son. She was denied entry to the United States for months because of the Muslim travel ban.
From the I24NEWS studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Tal Heinrich.
U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis is retiring at the end of February. In his resignation letter to President Trump, Mattis said that Mr. Trump should have a defense secretary whose, quote, views are better aligned with yours.
The resignation comes as President Trump is feeling the backlash from both sides of the aisle over his decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria.
And again, in addition to Jim Mattis, of course, there's a lot of criticism coming from members of Congress. In a tweet, though, President Trump is pushing back. He took to Twitter defending his action, saying that ISIS will not be America's problem anymore. Russia, Iran, and Syria, and many others are not happy about the U.S. leaving, despite what the fake news says, because now they will have to fight ISIS and others who they hate without us.
But in his annual news conference, Russian President Vladimir Putin supported the move, saying the U.S. has no right to be in Syria at all.
Is the presence of American forces necessary? I think not. Let us not forget that their presence of your forces is not legitimate. It is not acknowledged by a United Nations Security Council resolution. Military forces can be there only by the decision of the UN Security Council or by the invitation of the legitimate government of Syria. We are there at the invitation of the Syrian government. They have neither this nor that, so if the U.S. decided to withdraw their forces, that is correct.
Back in the U.S., Republican Senator Lindsey Graham was flanked by Democrats as he spoke to reporters. He said the war against ISIS is not over, and leaving gives Russia more power in Syria and ultimately endangers the United States.
This isn't akin to surrendering. We can be successful only if we partner with others. This undercuts that effort. We've got two choices to fight this war: in their backyard or our backyard. And ISIS in Afghanistan, I know for sure, is looking toward the United States and their target sets. Mr. President, you have a chance to change course. You have a lot of bipartisan support to do so. Take advantage of it.
Let's bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv. And Dan, no doubt that Syria was crucial in terms of Jim Mattis's decision to resign?
I'd say no doubt. The resignation letter is a two-page document, and so it does say, for instance, that Mattis is proud of what's been accomplished in the Trump administration so far. But it also says that he has very strong views, meaning retired General Mattis, very strong views about the need to work with partners and allies. And it's pretty clear that he disagrees with President Trump on that. He says, as you reported, that the president has the right to have a defense secretary whose views are better aligned with yours on these and other subjects. And that's after Mattis mentioned the decision on still fighting ISIS and the president claiming that ISIS has been defeated in Syria. Clearly, Mattis disagreed with those subjects. Those are burning issues right now. And so Mattis, at age 68, said, I'm leaving at the end of February. President Trump, on the other hand, he tweeted that the defense secretary would be retiring at the end of February and greatly thanked Mattis for his service. So far, Trump has not shown if he's angry at his defense secretary. He probably is. David Intel?
Dan, how long before we start hearing rumors that Jared Kushner is due to replace James Mattis?
Well, I don't think he'd be qualified, but it does underline the notion that President Trump will want someone who's loyal to him. Do you remember the generals, how proud President Trump was to have generals on his staff? For a while, the national security advisor was General H.R. McMaster, but Trump fired him. As for the chief of staff at the White House, General John Kelly, he's leaving next week, forced out, kind of an amicable separation. And now General Mattis, the defense secretary, he's decided he can't serve any longer under someone as, well, unconventional as President Trump. David and Tal?
Dan Raviv, senior Washington correspondent. Dan, thank you very much. And to discuss, let's bring in John Sidolides, a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. And John, President Trump used to refer to Kelly and Mattis as my generals. Are you surprised that they're leaving?
I'm not surprised that they're leaving. I mean, with Kelly, it's obviously been well known for quite some time. But with General Mattis, you see a resignation letter that, in classic Mattis style, is both distinguished and heroic. I mean, he's a man of the classics. He's been studying military history, but he's also a very loyal man. But I think at some point, you reach that breaking point, and whether it's Syria, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's the combination, or what Mattis seems to feel is the disrespect for our allies in the region, and what could be potentially devastating, enormously consequential geostrategic ramifications, not necessarily from the pullout from Syria, but the manner in which it's being conducted, I think is very troublesome for Madison. At some point, he just feels he cannot serve President Trump in the current capacity.
And President Trump, this day, he tried to answer to critics criticizing this move to pull out of Syria, also within the Republican Party. And he asks, does the United States want to be the policeman of the Middle East? So on one hand, it's true. ISIS has not been defeated yet, and yet ISIS is an ideology. An ideology it's very hard to defeat. Do you think he's making a mistake, the president, by pulling out of there?
I think it's a very perplexing decision, to say the least. Our job is clearly not finished, and it won't be probably for years, if not decades, to come. However, Trump was very clear about this in the 2016 campaign, that he did not intend to have U.S. forces fighting in Syria indefinitely. And I think one of the things that he's made clear in his domestic policy considerations is he expects the bureaucracy to actually carry out his intentions. It may be that he was frustrated that the Pentagon didn't have a clear exit strategy for Syria, didn't have a coherent policy for what we'd be doing vis-a-vis Russia, Iran, and Turkey's getting ready to invade that part of Syria now to root out the Kurds that it feels are terrorists looking to carve out the southeastern part of the Republic of Turkey. So all of these strategic ramifications, again, of enormous consequence. It shouldn't come as a surprise, but maybe the Pentagon failed to convince the president they had a smart strategy going forward.
Do you think the president doesn't know that the Kurds owe the United States for doing the dirty work in the battle against Islamic State? Or maybe he has been convinced by Turkish President Erdogan that there won't be this onslaught on the Kurds that so many people seem to fear?
The unnerving part about this, from my perspective, is that the appearance that we're giving is that we're abandoning allies. They were basically the land force against Islamic State, while we provided air power to try and decimate that force in northeastern Syria. What are we going to do next time we need allies to fight either a government or irregular forces or terrorist organizations, and they point to the way we dropped the Kurds seemingly on a dime after their enormous sacrifices and potentially leaving them vulnerable to a massive Turkish incursion into Syria in the weeks ahead? So this is very problematic on multiple fronts, and it's very difficult to understand what drove the president's decision at this time and in this way.
Well, regarding the Kurds, I think it's not so surprising, given the fact that the United States didn't really support the Kurds in Iraq in the referendum for independence. So these are the Kurds in Syria feeling now betrayal. But I want to ask you, will Afghanistan be next?
Afghanistan is next. We are going to be pulling out of Afghanistan. And again, the president has been very clear there. We don't seem to have a coherent strategy for winning the war in Afghanistan. It's the longest running war in American history. And if we travel across the United States, the American people have been asking for years, prior to Trump, during the Obama administration, and even in the Bush administration, what is the end game in Afghanistan? Why are American soldiers dying there? Is there a better way to make sure that al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and other terror groups don't plan attacks against the United States, our Western partners, and our regional allies, rather than an indefinite stationing of forces?
John Sidolides, a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy. John, thank you. We appreciate it. Still ahead, the latest on North Korea. We'll get to that ahead.